In the sprawling hills of Malibu, where million-dollar mansions perch like golden eagles against the Pacific coastline, the Morrison estate stood as a monument to success. But behind its pristine white columns and manicured gardens, a mystery was unfolding that would shatter everything the family thought they knew about their perfect life. It started with the sound of tiny hands and knees against hardwood floors, always moving in the same direction, always toward the same corner of the third-floor attic. And it would end with a discovery so profound that it would rewrite the Morrison family history forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Diane Rodriguez had been cleaning houses in Los Angeles for 15 years, but she had never worked anywhere quite like the Morrison estate. The three-story Mediterranean-style mansion sprawled across 4 acres of prime Malibu real estate, complete with an infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the Pacific Ocean below. When she'd first walked through the ornate iron gate 6 months ago, responding to a job posting for a live-in housekeeper, she'd felt like she was entering a different world entirely. The master of the house, Marcus Morrison, was a tech mogul who'd made his fortune developing security software for major corporations. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd never had to worry about money, his silver-streaked dark hair always perfectly styled, his handshakes firm but brief. He spoke in measured tones and treated Diane with professional courtesy, though she sometimes caught him watching her work with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. His wife, Victoria Morrison, was everything Diane had expected from a tech billionaire's spouse. Blonde, impeccably dressed, and 10 years younger than her husband, Victoria moved through their home like she was constantly posing for an invisible photographer. She'd been a marketing executive before their marriage, Marcus had mentioned once, but now she dedicated herself to charity galas and yoga retreats. Her interactions with Diane were polite but distant, peppered with requests delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, without question. But it was their daughter who had captured Diane's heart completely. 18-month-old Emma Morrison was a cherubic child, with Marcus's dark eyes and Victoria's golden curls. She had just learned to crawl with determined efficiency, pulling herself across the house's marble floors and Persian rugs with the focused intensity of a tiny explorer. Most babies her age crawled randomly, distracted by toys or shadows or interesting textures. But Emma was different. Emma had a destination. Every morning, without fail, Emma would wake from her nap and immediately begin crawling toward the main staircase. Her little legs would pump with surprising strength as she navigated around furniture legs and past doorways, always heading upward. If left to her own devices, she would crawl up the first flight of stairs to the 2nd floor, then continue to the narrower staircase that led to the 3rd floor, and finally to the pull-down ladder that accessed the attic. The first time Diane had witnessed this behavior, she'd assumed it was coincidence. Babies were naturally curious, after all, and staircases were fascinating obstacles to conquer. But as the weeks passed, Emma's pattern became unmistakable. No matter where she started in the house, the living room, the kitchen, even the outdoor patio, she would eventually make her way to those stairs. More unsettling was what happened when Emma reached the attic. The 3rd floor of the Morrison house was largely unused, serving mainly as storage for out-of-season clothing and old business files. The attic itself was a cramped space under the eaves, accessible only by a wooden ladder that Marcus kept folded against the ceiling. Emma, of course, couldn't climb the ladder herself, but she would position herself directly beneath it and cry with a heartbreaking persistence until someone came to find her. Initially, both Marcus and Victoria had dismissed their daughter's behavior as a phase. "She'll grow out of it," Victoria would say, with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand, not looking up from her phone. "Babies do strange things. My nephew used to crawl under every table in the house." Marcus was more analytical in his approach. theorizing that perhaps Emma was drawn to the acoustics of the stairwell or responding to some scent carried by air currents. But Diane had noticed something that the Morrisons, busy with their own lives, had missed. Emma didn't just crawl to the attic access point and cry randomly. She always stopped at the exact same spot on the third-floor hallway, a seemingly unremarkable section of hardwood flooring about 3 feet from the eastern wall. And her cries weren't the general fussiness of a tired or frustrated baby. They were specific, urgent, almost conversational in their rhythm and tone. It was as if Emma was trying to communicate with someone. The more Diane observed Emma's behavior, the more convinced she became that the child was responding to something the adults couldn't perceive. During her years of housekeeping, she'd worked in homes where previous owners had left their mark in subtle ways. A squeaky floorboard that only responded to pressure in a certain spot. A draft that carried the lingering scent of someone's favorite perfume. The way morning light hit a particular window and cast shadows that seemed almost intentionally meaningful. But Emma's fixation felt different, more purposeful, more urgent. Diane had grown up in a household where her grandmother spoke openly about the ways the past could bleed through into the present. Los muertos no siempre se van, her abuela used to say. The dead don't always leave. As a child, Diane had dismissed these stories as superstition, the kind of old country beliefs that immigrant families eventually outgrew. But working in the Morrison house, watching Emma's daily pilgrimage to that corner of the third floor, she found herself remembering her grandmother's words with uncomfortable clarity. The Morrison family's history was surprisingly sparse for people of their wealth and prominence. When Diane had first started working for them, she'd naturally been curious about the house itself, a 1920s mansion with the kind of architectural details that suggested a colorful past. But when she'd asked Marcus about the property's history, he'd given her only the most basic information. They'd purchased it from an estate sale 5 years ago, he'd said. The previous owners had been an elderly couple with no children, and before that, the records were unclear. We bought it for the location and the bones of the structure, he'd explained, gesturing toward the vaulted ceilings and original crown molding. Everything else we renovated to our specifications. Victoria had been even less interested in discussing the house's past. I don't like old things, she'd said with a slight shudder when Diane had mentioned the beautiful original tilework in the kitchen. They carry too much history. I prefer to create my own aesthetic rather than inherit someone else's choices. But despite their renovations, the house retained an unmistakable sense of its own personality. There were rooms that felt naturally welcoming and others that seemed to resist human presence. There were corners where dust accumulated faster than anywhere else, despite Diane's meticulous cleaning schedule. And there was that third floor with its narrow hallway and low ceilings, where the air always felt slightly different, cooler in summer, warmer in winter, as if the space existed in its own microclimate. Emma seemed to be the only member of the Morrison family who truly paid attention to these subtleties. While her parents moved through their home with the casual indifference of people who viewed their surroundings as a backdrop for their own lives, Emma approached each room with the focused attention of someone conducting a careful investigation, and her investigation always led to the same place. As the weeks turned into months, Diane found herself looking forward to Emma's afternoon crawling expeditions with a mixture of affection and unease. She would follow at a discreet distance, ostensibly to ensure the child's safety, but actually to observe the ritual that had become such a consistent part of the household rhythm. Emma would wake from her nap, immediately orient herself toward the main staircase, and begin her determined journey upward. Her pace was always the same, not hurried but purposeful, as if she were keeping an appointment she couldn't afford to miss. Today, as Diane folded laundry in the second-floor guest room, she heard the familiar sound of small hands and knees against hardwood. Through the open doorway, she watched Emma emerge from the nursery and begin her ascent to the third floor. The afternoon light streaming through the stairwell's tall windows caught the gold in the child's curls, creating a halo effect that made her look almost ethereal. Diane set down the towel she'd been folding and quietly followed Emma up the stairs. At the third-floor landing, Emma paused, as she always did, and looked directly at the corner where the eastern wall met the floor. Then she crawled to her usual spot and began to cry, not the wailing of distress, but a softer, more rhythmic sound that seemed almost like singing. Standing in the hallway, watching this daily ritual, Diane felt the familiar prickle of intuition that had served her well throughout her life. Something was calling to this child, something that lived in the space between the walls of this beautiful house, in the gap between its renovated present and its hidden past. And Diane was beginning to suspect that whatever it was, it had been waiting a very long time to be found. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 weeks later, everything changed on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Diane was preparing breakfast in the kitchen when she heard Victoria's voice rise to a pitch she'd never heard before. Sharp, panicked, cutting through the morning stillness like broken glass. The sound came from upstairs, followed immediately by Marcus's deeper voice, urgent and commanding, "Call 911! Now!" Diane dropped the orange she'd been peeling and ran toward the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. She found the Morrison parents in Emma's nursery, Victoria clutching her phone with shaking hands, while Marcus knelt beside the crib where Emma lay unnaturally still. The child's eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something beyond the ceiling. Her tiny body was rigid, her back arched in an impossible curve, her fists clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Most terrifying of all, she wasn't making a sound, no crying, no breathing that Diane could detect, just an eerie silence that filled the room like thick fog. "She won't respond," Marcus said, his voice steady but his hands trembling as he reached toward his daughter, then pulled back, afraid to touch her. "She's been like this for at least 5 minutes. Victoria found her when she went to get her up for breakfast." Victoria was sobbing into the phone, trying to give their address to the emergency dispatcher, while her words tumbled over each other in panic. "Morrison estate. Yes, Malibu. She's not moving. 18 months old." Diane approached the crib slowly, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. She'd seen this before, though not in a child so young. Her cousin Miguel had experienced something similar when he was 7, episodes where his body would lock up and his eyes would fix on empty air, as if he were seeing something the rest of the family couldn't perceive. But Miguel's episodes had been brief, lasting only seconds. Emma had been frozen like this for several minutes, and there was something about her stillness that felt different from a medical seizure. Her eyes weren't rolled back or fluttering. Instead, they were focused with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young, tracking something that moved across the ceiling in a pattern only she could see. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, their heavy boots echoing through the house as Marcus led them upstairs. By then, Emma had begun to show signs of movement, small twitches in her fingers, a slight turning of her head. But she remained largely unresponsive to voices or touch. "Has she had any seizures before?" asked the lead paramedic, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and capable hands who immediately began checking Emma's vital signs. "Never," Victoria replied, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. "She's been perfectly healthy. Her pediatrician says she's developing ahead of schedule." The paramedic frowned at her readings. "Her heart rate and breathing are normal now, but there are signs she experienced some kind of episode. We need to transport her for evaluation." As they prepared Emma for transport, securing her tiny form to a child-sized gurney, Diane noticed something that made her blood run cold. The child's eyes had finally begun to focus, and they were looking directly at the ceiling above her crib, the same ceiling that sat directly below the third-floor hallway. The exact spot where Emma crawled to every day. At the hospital, the tests revealed nothing. Blood work was normal. Brain scans showed no abnormalities. The neurologist, Dr. Patricia Hernandez, was thorough but ultimately puzzled. From what we can see, Emma is a perfectly healthy child, she told the Morrison parents as they sat in the sterile consultation room. Her episode could have been a one-time occurrence. Sometimes children experience what we call febrile seizures, even without fever. Or there could have been some kind of environmental trigger we can't identify. Environmental trigger? Marcus leaned forward, his business-trained mind immediately seeking concrete explanations. Like what? Loud noises, flashing lights, certain scents. Children are much more sensitive to their surroundings than adults. Sometimes they react to stimuli we don't even notice. Dr. Hernandez made notes in Emma's chart. I'd like to keep her for observation overnight, just to be safe. If she has another episode, we'll be able to monitor her brain activity in real time. That night, while Emma slept peacefully in her hospital crib, Diane found herself unable to rest. She'd been given the evening off while the family dealt with the crisis, but instead of going to her own small apartment in town, she'd driven back to the Morrison estate. Something was pulling her there, a need to understand what had happened that morning. The house felt different without the family inside. Not empty, never empty, but expectant, as if it were holding its breath. Diane let herself in through the service entrance and made her way upstairs, drawn by instincts she didn't fully understand. In Emma's nursery, she stood beside the crib and looked up at the ceiling. The afternoon light streaming through the windows revealed nothing unusual, just white paint and crown molding, the same as in every other room. But as evening approached and shadows began to lengthen, Diane noticed something she'd never seen before. There was a water stain on the ceiling, barely visible except when the light hit it at precisely the right angle. It was small, perhaps the size of a dinner plate, and shaped vaguely like a handprint. More significantly, it was positioned directly above where Emma's head would rest when she slept. Diane fetched a flashlight from the kitchen and returned to examine the stain more closely. The mark definitely appeared to be water damage, probably old, judging by its faded appearance. But water stains didn't typically form such distinct shapes, and this one seemed to have fingers, 5 clear impressions radiating from a central palm. More troubling was what she discovered when she pressed her own hand against the ceiling. The plaster felt different under the stain, softer, as if whatever had caused the moisture had weakened the structural material beneath. When she pushed gently upward, she could feel the ceiling give slightly, creating a small depression that matched the handprint perfectly. Something had pressed down from above, with enough force and persistence to leave a permanent impression. Diane climbed to the 3rd floor, her flashlight beam dancing ahead of her in the gathering darkness. The hallway seemed narrower than usual, the shadows deeper. She positioned herself in the spot where Emma always stopped during her daily crawls and pointed the flashlight upward. The ceiling here showed no visible water damage, but when Diane pressed her hand against it, she felt the same softness, the same give in the plaster. Whatever had left the impression in Emma's nursery had been moving around up there, pressing against the ceiling from inside the attic space. The attic ladder was still folded against the ceiling, exactly as Marcus always kept it. But as Diane examined the mechanism more closely, she noticed something that made her heart race. The ladder's hinges showed recent signs of use. Small scratches in the metal, dust patterns that suggested it had been lowered and raised within the past few weeks. Someone had been in the attic. Someone who had access to the house when the family was sleeping, but that was impossible. The Morrison estate had state-of-the-art security, motion sensors throughout the house, cameras monitoring every entrance. Marcus's company specialized in security software, and he'd installed the most advanced systems available in his own home. No one could enter or move through the house without triggering alarms, unless whoever was doing it was already inside. Standing alone in the 3rd floor hallway, surrounded by shadows that seemed to pulse with their own life, Diane felt the full weight of what she was beginning to understand. Emma's daily crawling wasn't random behavior or childhood curiosity. The child was responding to someone or something that lived in the space above their heads, something that had been watching the family sleep, pressing against their ceiling, leaving handprint impressions that spoke of desperate attempts at communication. And today, for the first time, it had reached through somehow and touched Emma directly. Diane's hands trembled as she pulled down the attic ladder, the metal mechanism creaking in the silence. She had to know what was up there. She had to understand what was calling to Emma with such persistence that it had driven the child into some kind of trance state. As she climbed the rungs, her flashlight beam revealed the outline of the attic opening above her head. Beyond that threshold lay answers that would change everything she thought she knew about the Morrison family and their beautiful house. But first, she had to find the courage to look. The attic was a tomb of forgotten memories. Diane's flashlight beam swept across the cramped space, revealing dust motes dancing like spirits in the stagnant air. The wooden beams overhead were draped with cobwebs that hadn't been disturbed in months, contradicting her theory about recent intruders. Cardboard boxes lined the perimeter, labeled in Victoria's precise handwriting. Holiday decorations, Marcus college files, winter clothes. But it was what lay in the center of the space that made Diane's breath catch in her throat. Someone had created a makeshift living area. A thin mattress, yellowed with age, was positioned directly above Emma's nursery. Beside it sat a chipped ceramic bowl, a plastic water bottle, and what appeared to be the remnants of several meals: crackers, dried fruit, crumbs that suggested someone had been eating up here regularly. More disturbing were the photographs scattered across the mattress like fallen leaves. Diane knelt carefully, her knees creaking on the wooden planks, and picked up the nearest image. It showed Emma as a newborn, sleeping in her hospital bassinet. The angle was wrong, though, not taken by proud parents, but from a distance through glass, as if someone had been watching from outside the maternity ward. The next photograph showed Emma at 3 months old, crawling on the living room carpet. Then 6 months, taking her first tentative steps in the garden. 9 months, eating in her high chair. Each image captured intimate family moments, but all were taken from strange angles, through windows, from doorways, from positions that suggested the photographer had been hiding. Someone had been documenting Emma's entire life without the Morrison family's knowledge. At the bottom of the pile, Diane found older photographs that made her stomach lurch. They showed the house itself, but not as it looked now. These images were faded and yellowed, clearly taken decades ago. The same rooms, but with different furniture. Different wallpaper, different people. A young woman with dark hair sat in what was now the Morrisons' living room, holding a baby that looked remarkably like Emma. The woman's face was partially obscured by shadow, but her posture spoke of exhaustion and desperation. Behind her, barely visible in the photograph's background, stood a man whose face had been deliberately scratched out with something sharp. Diane turned the photograph over. In spidery handwriting, someone had written, "Sarah and baby Catherine, 1987, before everything went wrong." The next morning, Diane waited until the Morrison family returned from the hospital before approaching Marcus with her discovery. Emma appeared to be fully recovered, chattering and crawling with her usual determination, showing no ill effects from the previous day's episode. But Diane noticed the child's eyes kept drifting toward the ceiling, as if she could see through the layers of wood and plaster to the space above. "Mr. Morrison," Diane said as he settled into his home office. "I need to speak with you about something I found in the attic." Marcus looked up from his laptop, his expression shifting from mild interest to sharp concern as Diane placed the photographs on his mahogany desk. He picked up the first image, Emma as a newborn, and his face went pale. "Where did you get these?" "In the attic. There's evidence someone has been living up there, at least part-time. These photos suggest they've been watching your family for over a year." Marcus rifled through the stack, his business-trained mind immediately cataloguing the security implications. "This is impossible," Our alarm system would have detected any unauthorized entry. The motion sensors, the door contacts, the window monitors. Nothing has been triggered. Unless whoever took these photos has been in the house since before you installed the security system, Diane said quietly. Or unless they know how to disable it. Marcus's face hardened. Are you suggesting someone from my own company is involved? Someone with inside knowledge of our security protocols? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just telling you what I found. Diane hesitated, then placed the older photographs on the desk. But there's more. These pictures are from decades ago. They show this house, but with different people living in it. Marcus examined the faded images, his frown deepening. Sarah and Catherine, 1987, he read aloud. I've never heard these names in connection with this property. The realtor said the house was owned by an elderly couple, the Hendersons, until we purchased it. Maybe the Hendersons weren't the only people who lived here. Maybe there were others, people whose stories weren't included in the official records. Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the estate grounds. This is completely unacceptable. I'm calling the police immediately. Someone has been stalking my family, violating our privacy, potentially endangering my daughter. But when Detective Ray Sullivan arrived that afternoon, his investigation raised more questions than it answered. A weathered man in his 50s, with the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen everything, Sullivan examined the attic with professional thoroughness. The living arrangements up there are definitely recent, he confirmed, photographing the mattress and personal items. But here's what's strange. There's no indication of how this person is getting in and out. No disturbed dust patterns near the ladder, no fingerprints on the access mechanism, no fiber evidence suggesting regular passage through the house. What are you saying? Victoria demanded. She'd been growing increasingly agitated since learning about the photographs, checking and rechecking the locks on Emma's nursery door. I'm saying whoever is doing this is either extremely careful about covering their tracks, or they have access to the house in a way we haven't considered yet. Sullivan pocketed his notebook. I'll have our lab analyze these photographs for any identifying features and will increase patrols in your neighborhood. In the meantime, I recommend changing all your security codes and installing additional cameras, including one focused on the attic access point. After the detective left, the Morrison house felt different. The easy luxury that had defined their daily routine was replaced by an undercurrent of suspicion and fear. Victoria jumped at every unexpected sound. Marcus installed temporary motion sensors in the hallway outside Emma's room. Even Emma seemed to sense the change, spending less time in her usual playful crawling expeditions and more time clinging to her parents. But Diane couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something fundamental about the situation. That night, after the family had gone to bed, she found herself standing once again in the third-floor hallway, staring at the attic access point. The photographs bothered her more than the evidence of an intruder. Whoever had taken those images of Emma had done so with obvious affection. The angles were carefully chosen to capture the child's most endearing moments, her first smile, her wobbly attempts at walking, her concentrated face as she played with toys. These weren't the photographs of a predator or someone with malicious intent. They were the photographs of someone who loved Emma deeply. But that raised an even more disturbing question. Who would feel such intense connection to a child they weren't supposed to know? And why would that person choose to remain hidden in the shadows of the attic rather than revealing themselves? Diane thought about the older photographs, particularly the image of Sarah and baby Catherine. The woman's exhausted posture, the deliberately scratched-out face of the man in the background, the notation that something had gone wrong, all suggested a story of family trauma, possibly violence. What if whoever was living in the attic wasn't a stranger at all? What if they were connected to the house's hidden history, to the people who had lived here before the official records began? What if Sarah and baby Catherine weren't just previous residents, but part of a story that had never been properly resolved? Standing alone in the hallway, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the house settling for the night, Diane made a decision that would change everything. The police investigation was focused on identifying an intruder and securing the property. But Diane suspected the real answers lay in understanding who Sarah and Catherine were, what had happened to them in 1987, and why their story seemed to be repeating itself with Emma tomorrow. She would begin her own investigation into the Morrison estate's true history. She would find out who had lived in this house during the decades that were mysteriously absent from the public records, and she would discover why someone who loved Emma enough to document every moment of her young life felt compelled to remain, hidden in the shadows above their heads. The truth was waiting somewhere in the gap between the official story and the hidden reality. Diane was determined to find it, no matter how dangerous it might prove to be. Diane's search for answers led her to the Malibu Public Library's local history archives, a cramped basement room that smelled of old paper and forgotten stories. The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s named Eleanor Patterson, regarded Diane with obvious curiosity as she requested records dating back to the 1980s. Most people who come down here are genealogy enthusiasts or college students working on research papers, Eleanor said, her fingers dancing across the computer keyboard with surprising speed. What's your interest in that particular time period? Diane hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I'm researching a property on Ocean View Drive. I found some old photographs, and I'm trying to understand who lived there before the current owners. Eleanor's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. Ocean View Drive, that's the old Morrison estate now, isn't it? Used to be called Seaview Manor back in the day. She paused, studying Diane's face. You work for the Morrison family? I do. I'm their housekeeper. Something in Eleanor's demeanor changed completely. She leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Then you need to know the real story about that house. The story they don't put in the real estate listings. Eleanor disappeared into the stacks, returning with a box of newspaper clippings and official documents. I've been the local history librarian here for 32 years. I remember when the Sarah Castellanos story broke. It was the biggest scandal Malibu had seen in decades. She spread the materials across the table, revealing headlines that made Diane's blood run cold. Local woman claims husband tried to kill her and baby. Mysterious disappearance rocks affluent Malibu family. Search continues for missing mother and child. The newspaper photograph showed a young woman who looked remarkably like the Sarah from Diane's found photos. But this woman was battered and frightened, holding a baby while speaking to reporters from what appeared to be a hospital bed. Sarah Castellanos married into money, Eleanor explained, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd told this story many times before. Her husband, Robert Castellanos, owned several tech companies back in the early days of Silicon Valley. They lived in what you now know as the Morrison estate, and by all accounts it was a fairy tale marriage at first. Eleanor pointed to a society page clipping showing a glamorous couple at a charity gala. Robert Castellanos was handsome in an aggressive way, with cold eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. Sarah, radiant in an expensive gown, stood slightly behind him, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that could have been affection or nervousness. Things changed after baby Catherine was born. Neighbors started reporting strange sounds from the house, shouting, breaking glass, a woman screaming. But the Castellanos family had money and influence. When police occasionally responded to calls, Robert would meet them at the door, charming and apologetic, explaining away the disturbances as construction work or television volumes turned too high. Diane studied the photograph of baby Catherine, noting the striking resemblance to Emma. What happened to them? Sarah finally tried to escape in March of 1987. She showed up at Malibu General Hospital with a broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, and baby Catherine suffering from what doctors described as failure to thrive. She told anyone who would listen that her husband had been systematically poisoning both of them. Trying to make their deaths look like illness, Eleanor handed Diane a police report. Look at what she told the investigating officers. Diane read the typed statement, her hands trembling slightly. Sarah had described living in constant fear, watching her husband put unknown substances in their food and drinks. She'd mentioned hearing footsteps in the attic at night, finding evidence that Robert had been watching them sleep through holes drilled in the ceiling. Most chilling of all, she'd claimed that Robert had told her he would never let them leave, that he would rather see them dead than lose control over them. The investigation lasted 3 weeks, Eleanor continued. Police found evidence supporting some of Sarah's claims. Modified ceiling panels, surveillance equipment hidden throughout the house, containers of various chemicals in Robert's home office. But before they could arrest him, both Sarah and baby Catherine vanished from the safe house where social services had placed them. Vanished how? No one knows. The caseworker found their room empty one morning. No signs of struggle, no indication they'd left voluntarily. Their belongings were still there, including Catherine's favorite stuffed animal that Sarah said the child never went anywhere without. Eleanor's expression darkened. Robert claimed they'd run away to avoid testifying against him. He hired expensive lawyers, and without the victims present to press charges, the case eventually fell apart. Diane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. What happened to Robert? He continued living in the house for another 2 years, but neighbors reported increasingly erratic behavior. He was seen talking to himself in the garden, leaving food on the front porch, as if expecting visitors who never came. In 1989, he was found dead in the master bedroom, apparently from a heart attack. He was only 34 years old. Eleanor gathered the documents, but kept one newspaper clipping separate. This is the part that connects to your situation now. After Robert's death, the house sat empty for 15 years. Various families tried to live there, but none stayed longer than 6 months. They all reported the same things. Sounds of crying in the walls, cold spots that moved through rooms, the feeling of being watched. The final clipping showed a real estate listing from 2004. Historic Malibu estate seeks new family. Fully renovated. Price to sell. The Henderson couple who bought it in 2004 were different, Eleanor said. They were older, set in their ways, and they treated the house like a museum. They lived quietly there for 20 years, never mentioning any supernatural experiences. But they also never used the 3rd floor or attic. They had it sealed off completely. Diane's mind raced with implications. So when the Morrisons bought the house and renovated it, they reopened those sealed areas. Exactly. And now you're telling me there's evidence of someone living in the attic, taking photographs of their baby daughter, who looks remarkably like Catherine Castellanos would look today if she were alive. The two women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling between them. Finally, Eleanor spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. There's one more thing you need to know. I've been doing genealogy research as a hobby for years. Last month, I was working on local family trees when I discovered something interesting about your employers. She pulled out a manila folder from beneath the other documents. Victoria Morrison's maiden name was Victoria Castellanos. She's Robert's niece. Diane's world tilted sideways. That's impossible. She never mentioned any connection to the house's previous owners. Maybe she didn't know. Robert had several siblings who moved away from California after the scandal. It's possible Victoria's family changed their name or simply never spoke about their connection to what happened here. Eleanor paused, studying Diane's shocked expression. But it would explain why baby Emma looks so much like Catherine Castellanos. They're related. As Diane drove back to the Morrison estate, her mind churned with possibilities. If Victoria was Robert's niece, then Emma was a blood relative of both Robert and baby Catherine. The family connection could explain why Emma seemed drawn to the attic, why she responded to something the adults couldn't perceive. But it raised even more disturbing questions. If Sarah and Catherine had died in 1987, who was living in the attic now? And why were they so focused on Emma, a child who shared their bloodline? Diane thought about the photographs she'd found. the careful documentation of Emma's growth and development. Someone was watching over the child with fierce protectiveness. Someone who understood the dangers that could come from the Castellanos family history. As she pulled through the estate gates, Diane noticed Emma playing in the front garden with her mother. The child looked up as the car approached, and for just a moment, Diane could have sworn she saw an adult figure standing behind Emma, a young woman with dark hair who vanished the instant Diane blinked. Whatever was happening in the Morrison house, it wasn't a simple case of a dangerous intruder. It was something far more complex, rooted in decades of family trauma and unresolved loss. And Diane was beginning to suspect that the presence in the attic wasn't trying to harm Emma at all. It was trying to protect her from a pattern of violence that had already claimed one mother and child, and was threatening to repeat itself with another generation. Armed with the truth about the Castellanos' family history, Diane knew she had to confront Victoria. But the opportunity didn't come until 3 days later, when Marcus left for a business trip to San Francisco and Emma was napping peacefully in her crib. Victoria was in her private sitting room, a sun-drenched space overlooking the ocean, where she typically spent afternoons responding to charity committee emails and planning social events. She looked up from her laptop as Diane entered, her expression shifting from mild annoyance at the interruption to genuine concern when she saw the manila folder in Diane's hands. "Mrs. Morrison, we need to talk about your family history," Diane said, settling into the chair across from Victoria without waiting for an invitation. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers stilled on her keyboard. "I'm not sure what you mean." Diane opened the folder and placed the 1987 newspaper clippings on the coffee table between them. Victoria's face went ashen as she recognized the photographs of Sarah and baby Catherine, her eyes widening when she saw the headline mentioning the Castellanos' name. "Your maiden name was Victoria Castellanos," Diane said quietly. "Robert Castellanos was your uncle." For a long moment, Victoria said nothing. Then she closed her laptop with trembling hands and picked up the newspaper clipping, showing Robert at the charity gala. Her expression was unreadable, but tears began streaming down her cheeks. "I haven't seen this photograph in 35 years, she whispered. "My mother burned every picture of Robert after what happened. She said his name was never to be spoken in our house again." "So you knew about Sarah and Catherine?" Victoria nodded slowly. "I was only 7 when it happened, but I remember the whispered conversations, the way adults would stop talking when I entered the room. My father was Robert's younger brother, and the scandal destroyed our family's reputation. We moved to Phoenix, changed our last name from Castellanos to Clayton, started completely over." She set down the photograph with shaking hands. "My parents told me that Robert had done terrible things to his wife and baby, and that they died because of his cruelty. I grew up thinking Sarah and Catherine were buried somewhere, victims of domestic violence that the police couldn't prove." "But you bought Robert's house," Diane pressed. "You and Marcus chose to live here, knowing what happened." Victoria's composure cracked completely. "Oh, I didn't know." "When Marcus showed me the listing 5 years ago, it was called Seaview Manor, owned by the Henderson family. The real estate agent never mentioned the Castellanos connection. The house had been completely renovated. I didn't recognize it from the few childhood memories I had." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the estate grounds. "I didn't realize until after we'd been living here for 6 months. I found a box of old legal documents in the basement storage room, papers the previous owners had missed during their cleanup. That's when I saw Robert's name on the original deed." "Why didn't you tell Marcus?" "Because he would have insisted we sell immediately, and I couldn't." Victoria turned back to face Diane, her expression desperate. "By then I was pregnant with Emma. Something about this house felt right to me, in a way I couldn't explain. Despite its horrible history, it felt like home, like I belonged here." Diane studied Victoria's face, recognizing the same inexplicable connection to the house that Emma displayed. "Have you experienced anything unusual since living here? Sounds, movements, feelings that you couldn't explain?" Victoria hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Dreams, mostly. I dream about a young woman walking through the house at night, checking on Emma. In the dreams, she seems familiar, but I can never see her face clearly. And sometimes, when I'm working in this room, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Like someone is watching me through the windows. The woman in your dreams. Could she be Sarah? I don't know, maybe. The strange thing is, the dreams don't frighten me. If anything, they're comforting. Like someone is helping to protect Emma. Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. Do you think it's possible that Sarah and Catherine are still here somehow? That they never really left? Before Diane could answer, they were interrupted by the sound of Emma waking from her nap. But instead of the usual happy babbling that signaled the end of the child's rest, they heard something that made both women freeze in terror. Emma was screaming, not the ordinary crying of a child who wanted attention or comfort, but raw, primal screams of absolute terror that seemed to shake the walls of the house. Victoria ran toward the nursery with Diane close behind, their footsteps echoing through the hallways like gunshots. They found Emma standing in her crib, her face red with exertion, pointing at the ceiling and screaming words that sounded almost like no, go away. Her eyes were wide, with a fear that seemed impossible for someone so young, and she was backing away from something only she could see. Victoria scooped her daughter into her arms. But Emma continued screaming and pointing upward. What is it, baby? What's wrong? Above them, they could hear footsteps in the attic. Not the careful, stealthy movements Diane had detected before, but heavy, aggressive pacing that seemed to shake dust from the ceiling. The footsteps moved in a pattern that mirrored Emma's pointing finger, as if whatever was up there was responding to the child's terror. Then they heard voices, muffled but definitely human, coming through the ceiling. A woman's voice, pleading and desperate, followed by a man's voice, deeper and filled with rage. The words were indistinct, but the emotional content was unmistakable, an argument that was escalating toward violence. We need to get out of the house, Diane said urgently. Now, but Victoria was transfixed, listening to the voices above them. That's impossible. There's no one up there. The police searched the attic 3 days ago. The footsteps overhead became more frantic, accompanied by sounds of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Emma's screams reached a pitch that seemed to pierce through the very air, and suddenly the ceiling began to show signs of stress. Cracks appeared in the plaster, spreading outward from the center like a spider web. The ceiling is going to collapse, Diane shouted over Emma's cries. We have to move. She grabbed Victoria's arm, pulling her toward the hallway just as a section of the nursery ceiling gave way. Chunks of plaster crashed down onto Emma's crib, followed by something that made Diane's blood run cold. An old suitcase tumbled through the hole, bursting open as it hit the floor and spilling its contents across the nursery carpet. Children's clothing from decades past, yellowed photographs, and a small stuffed rabbit that looked exactly like the toy Emma carried everywhere. But most shocking of all were the bones. Small bones, clearly human, that scattered among the other items like accusations given physical form. Victoria stared at the remains in horrified understanding. Catherine, she whispered. We found Catherine. The voices overhead had gone silent, but the damage was done. The nursery ceiling gaped open like a wound, revealing the dark space above where someone had been hiding evidence for 37 years. And Emma, still screaming in her mother's arms, was pointing not at the ceiling anymore, but at the hallway behind them, where a young woman with dark hair stood watching, her face filled with a mixture of relief and desperate urgency. She looked exactly like the Sarah from the 1987 photographs, unchanged by the passage of decades. She's been protecting Catherine's body all these years, Diane realized aloud. And now she's trying to protect Emma from whoever killed them. The ghostly figure of Sarah raised one translucent hand, pointing toward the main staircase. Her mouth moved soundlessly, but her message was clear. They needed to leave the house immediately, because whoever had murdered Sarah and Catherine Castellanos wasn't finished with the family yet. And this time, they were coming for Emma. Victoria refused to leave the house. "This is insane," she said, clutching Emma tightly as they stood in the hallway outside the destroyed nursery. "You're asking me to believe that my dead uncle's ghost is somehow threatening my daughter based on what? A ceiling collapse and some old bones?" Diane stared at her in disbelief. Sarah's ghostly figure had vanished the moment Victoria looked directly at her, leaving behind only the evidence of Catherine's remains scattered across the nursery floor. But the urgency in Sarah's warning had been unmistakable. "Mrs. Morrison, you saw what just happened." Emma was terrified of something specific in that room. The ceiling didn't collapse from natural causes. Something forced it to give way. And those bones belonged to Catherine Castellanos, your cousin who supposedly disappeared 37 years ago. Victoria's face hardened with the stubborn determination that Diane had seen before when the woman made decisions about household management or social events. But this time, the consequences could be fatal. "I'm calling Marcus," Victoria said, pulling out her phone. "He needs to know about the structural damage to the nursery. And I'm calling our contractor to assess the ceiling throughout the house. This is a construction issue, not some supernatural vendetta," as Victoria spoke to her husband, explaining the ceiling collapse in purely practical terms, while omitting any mention of ghostly warnings or family connections. Diane felt a growing sense of doom. Marcus would return immediately, of course. He would bring engineers and contractors and security experts. But none of them would understand the real danger, and their presence might make the situation even more volatile. Over the next 6 hours, the Morrison estate was transformed into a construction zone. Marcus arrived with a team of structural engineers who declared the third floor unsafe until extensive repairs could be completed. The nursery was sealed off with plastic sheeting, and Emma was moved to a temporary bedroom on the second floor. But the increased activity seemed to agitate whatever presence had been living in the house. As evening approached, the disturbances escalated beyond anything Diane had witnessed before. It started with the lights. Every fixture in the house began flickering in sequence, as if some invisible force were moving from room to room, testing the electrical system. The pattern was too regular to be coincidental. 3 quick flashes, then darkness. Then 3 more flashes in the next room. "Electrical surge from the construction damage," Marcus explained to the increasingly nervous workers. "We'll have the power company check the main lines tomorrow." Then came the sounds. Footsteps in the walls, following the workers as they moved through the house. Whispered voices that seemed to come from the air vents. The sound of a baby crying that echoed through rooms where no child was present. "Old houses settle," Marcus told Victoria when she mentioned the noises. "The structural damage has probably shifted the foundation slightly. These sounds are normal during major repairs, but Diane knew better. She recognized the signs of a presence that was becoming increasingly desperate and angry. Sarah had tried to warn them subtly, then more directly. Now she was being ignored and dismissed, and her patience was wearing thin. The breaking point came at 2:17 a.m. Diane was awakened by Emma's screams coming from the temporary nursery. She ran downstairs to find Victoria and Marcus already there, trying to comfort their daughter, who was pointing frantically at the window. Outside, visible in the moonlight, stood a figure that made Diane's blood freeze. It was a man in his 30s, wearing clothes from the 1980s, his face twisted with rage. He was pressing his hands against the glass from the outside, leaving handprints that glowed with an unnatural light. His mouth was moving silently, but the hatred in his expression was unmistakable. Robert Castellanos had returned. "Do you see him?" Diane whispered to Victoria, but the woman was focused entirely on Emma, apparently oblivious to the ghostly figure at the window. Marcus was checking the security monitors on his phone. Motion sensors aren't detecting anything outside. The cameras show nothing unusual, but Emma could see him. The child's terrified screams were directed specifically at the window, at the spot where Robert's apparition continued its silent assault on the glass. And as Diane watched in horror, she realized that the handprints Robert was leaving were beginning to crack the window. "We need to get Emma out of this room," Diane said urgently. "The window isn't safe." "The window is fine," Marcus replied impatiently. "It's reinforced security glass. Nothing can break it from the outside." As if responding to his words, the glass began to spiderweb from the points where Robert's handprints pressed against it. The cracks spread slowly but steadily, accompanied by a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. "Marcus, look at the window!" Diane shouted. But when Marcus and Victoria turned to look, the ghostly figure vanished, leaving only the mysteriously cracked glass. To them, it appeared that the window had simply failed due to temperature stress or manufacturing defects. "I'll call the glazier in the morning," Marcus said, moving Emma's crib away from the damaged window. "For now, we'll cover it with plywood." As Marcus secured a temporary barrier over the cracked glass, Diane felt the full weight of their impossible situation. The supernatural forces at work in the house were invisible to the Morrison parents, making it impossible to convince them of the real danger. They would rationalize every incident, explain away every warning, until it was too late. Worse, Robert's appearance suggested that the situation was escalating beyond Sarah's ability to control. She had been protecting Catherine's remains and watching over Emma for decades, but now her abusive husband had found a way to manifest as well. The balance between protective and destructive forces was shifting toward violence. The next morning brought news that shattered any hope Diane had of convincing the Morrisons to take the supernatural threat seriously. Detective Sullivan called to inform them that the bones found in the nursery ceiling had been analyzed by the medical examiner. They belonged to a cat, not a human child. The stuffed animal was available in toy stores throughout the 1980s. The suitcase contained items that could have belonged to any family from that era. It appears someone was storing old belongings in your attic space, possibly during previous renovations, Sullivan explained over the phone. There's no evidence of foul play or connection to any missing persons cases. Victoria's relief was palpable. "So there's no connection to my uncle or the Sarah and Catherine story?" "None whatsoever. The lab found no human remains, no evidence of violence, nothing to suggest that the old Castellanos case has any bearing on your current situation." Marcus nodded with satisfaction. "What about the intruder who was living up there?" "We're still investigating that angle, but honestly, Mr. Morrison, the evidence is pretty thin. The items in the attic could have been left by previous owners, or even construction workers. Sometimes homeless individuals find ways into unoccupied spaces, but your security system makes that unlikely." After the call ended, Marcus and Victoria exchanged looks of mutual relief. The rational explanations had won. The supernatural fears had been debunked. They could return to their normal lives with some additional security measures and structural repairs. But Diane knew the truth was far more dangerous than what the scientific analysis had revealed. The bones might have belonged to a cat, but Catherine Castellanos had still been murdered in this house. Sarah's spirit was still trying to protect Emma from a pattern of family violence that transcended death, and Robert's ghostly presence, invisible to everyone except Emma and Diane, was growing stronger with each passing hour. Standing alone in the kitchen as the Morrison family celebrated the resolution of their supernatural crisis, Diane realized she was completely on her own. No one would believe her warnings. No one would help her protect Emma from a threat they couldn't see. The house had claimed 2 lives in 1987. Now it was preparing to claim 2 more, and Diane was the only person standing between Emma and the same fate that had befallen Catherine Castellanos 37 years ago. The real battle was just beginning, and Diane had never felt more alone. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on a night when Diane couldn't sleep. She'd been lying in her small room on the ground floor, listening to the house settle around her, when she heard something that made her sit up in bed. Not the usual creaking of old wood or the whisper of wind through the eaves, but a sound she'd never heard before, a woman singing a lullaby. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a mother's love and desperate protectiveness. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, drifting through the walls like smoke. And it was moving, traveling through the house in a pattern that Diane recognized, the same route Emma took during her daily crawling expeditions. Diane slipped out of bed and followed the sound, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. The lullaby led her upstairs, through the second floor, and finally to the third floor, where it stopped directly above Emma's new temporary nursery. But this time, instead of the usual whispered presence she'd sensed before, Diane could see Sarah Castellanos clearly. The young woman sat in the hallway, her back against the wall, looking down through the floor as if she could see through the wood and plaster to the child sleeping below. Her clothes were the same ones from the 1987 photographs, but her face showed the accumulated wisdom of decades spent in vigil. "You can see me now," Sarah said without looking up. Her voice carried the weight of years of silence. "Really see me, not just glimpses and shadows." Diane approached cautiously, unsure if this was a dream or waking vision. "You've been trying to protect Emma from the moment she was born." Sarah's eyes, when she finally looked at Diane, were filled with an ancient sadness. "She has Catherine's soul. I know that sounds impossible, but some connections transcend death. When Victoria brought her baby to this house, I felt Catherine's presence immediately, but Catherine died here." "You both died here," Sarah shook her head slowly. "Catherine lived. For 3 days after Robert locked us in the attic, she lived. I kept her alive as long as I could, sharing what little food and water I had hidden away. But she was so small, so fragile. When she left me, I couldn't bear to let her body be found by him. I couldn't let him desecrate her memory with his lies about accidents and illnesses." The pieces of the mystery began falling into place in Diane's mind. "You hid her body in the walls, between the ceiling joists, wrapped in my wedding dress. I sang to her every night, the same lullaby I'm singing now. And I waited for someone to find us, someone to expose Robert's crimes." Sarah's expression hardened. "But he was too clever, too connected. When the police finally came, he convinced them we'd run away. He made us disappear from official records while keeping us trapped in this house forever." "How did you die?" "Starvation 3 weeks after Catherine. But even death couldn't break the bond between a mother and child. I stayed to guard her, to make sure no one could hurt her again." Sarah stood gracefully, moving to the window that overlooked the ocean. "For 37 years I kept watch. And then Emma came, and I knew Catherine had found her way back to me." Diane felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she understood the depth of Sarah's sacrifice. "But Robert is here too now. He's getting stronger. Yes, his rage has been building for decades, fed by the family's return to this house. Victoria's blood called to him across the veil between life and death. He sees Emma as his chance to finish what he started, to claim complete ownership over the women in his family bloodline. Why can't the Morrisons see him? Why can only Emma and I perceive the supernatural activity?" Sarah turned back to Diane with something approaching a smile. "Emma sees because she carries Catherine's soul. She remembers on some level what happened here. As for you," Sarah studied Diane's face carefully, "you have the gift. Your grandmother knew it, didn't she? That's why she taught you about the spaces between worlds." Diane nodded, remembering her abuela's stories about spirits and the importance of listening to what others couldn't hear. "But Robert is learning to manifest in ways that affect the physical world," Sarah continued, her expression growing urgent. "The cracked windows, the ceiling collapse. He's breaking through the barriers that normally separate the living from the dead. Soon he won't need the family to see him. He'll be able to touch Emma directly. How do we stop him? We give him what he's always wanted, complete control." Sarah's eyes glinted with desperate cunning. "But we make sure it destroys him in the process." Over the next hour, Sarah explained her plan. It was dangerous, requiring Diane to put herself at tremendous risk, but it was the only way to break the supernatural. Hold Robert had on the house and protect Emma from the cycle of violence that had claimed Catherine. Robert's greatest weakness is his need to dominate, Sarah said. He can't simply kill. He has to break his victims first, make them acknowledge his power over them. That compulsion is what kept me and Catherine trapped here even after death, and it's what will allow us to trap him. The plan required 3 elements: a confrontation that would force Robert to fully manifest, a trap that would bind him to the physical world long enough to destroy him, and a sacrifice that would sever his connection to the Castellanos bloodline forever. The confrontation must happen in the master bedroom where he died, Sarah explained. That's where his power is strongest, but it's also where he's most vulnerable. If we can get him to appear there in full physical form, we can bind him using the same methods he used to trap us. What kind of methods? Sarah's expression darkened. Blood connection. He used Catherine's blood to create a supernatural link that kept us anchored to this house even after death. We can reverse that process, but it requires blood from the current generation. Emma's blood. Diane recoiled. I won't hurt that child, just a few drops. Nothing that would harm her. But her blood carries both Catherine's soul and Robert's family genetics. Used correctly, it can create a binding spell that will trap Robert in physical form long enough for us to destroy him permanently. And the sacrifice? Sarah's voice became barely audible. One of us has to take Robert's place in the binding. Someone has to remain tied to this house to ensure he can never return. I've been here for 37 years. I can stay for eternity if it means Emma lives free. As dawn approached, Diane found herself agreeing to a plan that seemed impossible and terrifying in equal measure. But watching Emma sleep peacefully in her temporary nursery, unaware of the supernatural battle being fought over her soul, Diane knew she had no choice. That evening, while Marcus worked late in his office and Victoria attended a charity committee meeting, Diane would put Sarah's plan into motion. They would confront Robert Castellanos in the master bedroom where his reign of terror had begun, and they would end it once and for all. But first, Diane had to convince Emma's parents to leave the house for several hours without revealing why their daughter's life depended on it. Standing in the hallway where Sarah's spirit had finally revealed the truth, Diane realized she was about to embark on the most dangerous night of her life. Success would free the Morrison family from a supernatural threat they didn't even know existed. Failure would cost Emma her life and damn Sarah's soul to an eternity of torment. Either way, by tomorrow morning, the 37-year-old mystery of Sarah and Catherine Castellanos would finally be resolved. Getting the Morrison parents to leave the house required a carefully orchestrated deception that made Diane's stomach churn with guilt. She waited until Thursday evening, when Victoria was preparing for her weekly yoga class and Marcus was reviewing quarterly reports in his study. Emma was playing contentedly in the living room, stacking colorful blocks with the focused determination that characterized everything she did. Mrs. Morrison, Diane said, approaching Victoria as she gathered her yoga mat and water bottle. I've been thinking about what happened with the ceiling collapse. Maybe it would be good for Emma to have a change of scenery for a few hours tonight. The construction dust and noise have been stressing her. Victoria paused, considering. What did you have in mind? There's a wonderful children's restaurant in Santa Monica with an indoor playground. Very clean, very safe. You and Mr. Morrison could have a nice dinner while Emma plays with other children. It might help her sleep better tonight. The suggestion appealed to Victoria's constant desire to appear as the perfect mother. That's actually a lovely idea. Marcus has been so stressed about the house repairs. A family evening out might be exactly what we need. Within an hour, Diane had successfully convinced both parents that a spontaneous family dinner was essential for Emma's emotional well-being. She even helped them research the restaurant online, pointing out its excellent safety ratings and child-friendly atmosphere. Are you sure you don't want to come with us? Marcus asked as they prepared to leave. You've been working so hard with all the construction chaos. I'll stay and tidy up the damage from today's work, Diane replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Maybe get a head start on tomorrow's cleaning. As she watched the Morrisons' Mercedes disappear through the estate gates, Diane felt the weight of what she was about to attempt. Sarah's plan required precise timing and unwavering courage. One mistake could cost Emma her life, even if the child was safely miles away. The house felt different the moment the family left. The air grew thicker, charged with supernatural energy that had been suppressed by their presence. Lights flickered without cause, and Diane could hear movement in the walls, not the careful protective presence of Sarah, but something heavier and more aggressive. Robert knew what was coming. Diane began her preparations in Emma's temporary nursery, following Sarah's detailed instructions. She gathered the items needed for the binding ritual: a silver knife from the kitchen, white candles from Victoria's meditation supplies, and a small vial to collect the few drops of Emma's blood they would need. The blood collection had been the most challenging part of the plan. That afternoon, while changing Emma's diaper, Diane had gently pricked the child's finger with a sterilized needle, barely enough to draw a single drop, but sufficient for their purposes. Emma had barely noticed, more interested in the colorful mobile above her changing table than the tiny pinprick on her finger. Now, with the precious vial secured in her pocket, Diane made her way to the master bedroom, where the final confrontation would take place. The Morrisons' bedroom was a study in modern luxury: clean lines, expensive fabrics, and carefully curated artwork that spoke of wealth and refined taste. But as Diane arranged the white candles in a circle around the room, the space began to transform. Shadows gathered in corners where no shadows should exist. The temperature dropped noticeably, and frost began forming on the windows despite the warm evening air outside. Sarah appeared first, materializing in the center of the candlelit circle. Her spirit form looked more solid than before, as if the approaching confrontation was giving her increased power to manifest in the physical world. "He's coming," she said simply. "I can feel his rage building. Are you ready?" Diane nodded, though her hands shook as she lit the final candle. "What exactly do I need to do?" "When Robert appears, he'll try to intimidate you first. He always starts with psychological torture before moving to physical violence. Don't let him break your resolve. Remember that his power comes from fear and submission, and the blood binding." Sarah held up her hand, revealing a matching silver knife that glowed with ethereal light. "I'll create the circle using Catherine's essence, the part of her that lives in Emma. You'll complete the binding with Emma's blood. The connection between past and present will trap him in physical form. How long will we have once he's trapped? Minutes at most. Once he realizes what we've done, he'll fight with everything he has to break free. That's when we must destroy the source of his power, which is—" Sarah's expression grew grim. "His wedding ring. He used it to bind me and Catherine to this house through our blood connection to him. It's buried with his body in Malibu cemetery, but his spirit has maintained a link to it across the veil. If we can sever that connection permanently, his power will be broken." Before Diane could ask how they were supposed to reach a cemetery during a supernatural confrontation in the bedroom, the temperature plummeted another 20 degrees. The candle flames began flickering wildly, and a presence filled the room that made Diane's skin crawl with primitive terror. Robert Castellanos materialized slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. First his outline, then his features, finally his expression of barely contained fury. He was exactly as he'd appeared in the 1987 Society photographs, but his face was twisted with decades of accumulated rage and madness. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the authority he'd wielded in life. "Still playing the protective mother, I see. And you've brought a witness to our family reunion." Sarah stepped protectively in front of Diane. "Leave her alone, Robert." "This is between us," Robert laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Everything in this house is between us, my dear wife, including the new baby who carries our family blood. Catherine's soul has returned to me, just as I always knew it would." "Emma isn't yours," Diane said, finding her voice despite the fear that threatened to paralyze her. "She belongs to Marcus and Victoria. You have no claim on her." Robert's attention shifted to Diane with predatory focus. "The hired help speaks. How refreshing. Tell me, little housekeeper, do you know what I did to the last woman who tried to interfere in my family affairs? Images flooded Diane's mind. Horrible visions of Sarah's final days, trapped in the attic with her dying child, begging for mercy that never came. The psychological assault was so intense that Diane fell to her knees, overwhelmed by borrowed memories of terror and desperation. "Stop!" Sarah shouted, raising her silver knife. The blade cut through the air, leaving a trail of light that seemed to wound Robert's spirit form. He staggered backward, momentarily surprised by her ability to fight back. "You've grown stronger," he admitted, his tone shifting from mockery to grudging respect. "Death has taught you new tricks." "I've had 37 years to prepare for this moment," Sarah replied. 37 years to plan your destruction." Robert's expression hardened. "Then let's finish what we started, shall we?" The supernatural battle that followed defied everything Diane thought she knew about the laws of physics. Robert and Sarah fought with weapons of pure spiritual energy, their conflict sending shockwaves through the bedroom that shattered mirrors and cracked the walls. Furniture flew through the air as if caught in an invisible hurricane, and the candles blazed with unnatural intensity. But gradually, Diane realized that Sarah was losing. Robert's rage gave him power that her protective love couldn't match. He was forcing her back, preparing to deliver a final blow that would scatter her spirit to the winds and leave Emma completely vulnerable to his influence. That's when Diane understood her true role in Sarah's plan. She wasn't just a witness or assistant, she was the key to victory. Because Robert's greatest weakness wasn't his need to dominate. It was his inability to conceive that anyone would willingly sacrifice themselves for others. Standing in the center of the candlelit circle, surrounded by supernatural violence that could tear her apart, Diane made the choice that would determine Emma's fate. She pulled out the vial of Emma's blood and shattered it against the floor, mixing the child's essence with her own tears as she spoke words Sarah had taught her, words in a language older than English, older than memory. The binding spell activated with a sound like thunder, and suddenly Robert Castellanos was no longer a spirit. He was flesh and blood, trapped in the physical world and absolutely furious about it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.